They told him to leave, but his response left an entire room speechless and changed their lives forever. The diner was a staple in the small Indiana town, our look of the 1960s, with its neon sign flickering above the entrance and checkered curtains framing the windows. It had a reputation for hearty meals and the kind of service where the waitress knew your name and how you liked your coffee. For David, it was his first stop after returning home from deployment, a quiet place to sight and feel a semblance of normality after months of chaos overseas. The parking lot was nearly full with pickup trucks lined up beside a few sedans. David stepped out of his truck. His polished boots crunched against the gravel. His uniform was immaculate, not a thread out of place. The metal spin to his chest caught the soft afternoon light, a testament to the sacrifices he'd made and the courage he'd shown. But David wasn't one to draw attention to himself. For him, the uniform wasn't about accolade. It was about service and duty principles she held on to even when they felt like a heavy weight to bear. She approached the diner. The doorjai, gled with a small bell above it inside the familiar hum of a small-town gathering, greeted him, laughter-clinking silverware, the sizzle of burgers on the griddle. The air was thick with the comforting scent of frying bacon and brewed coffee, the kind of aroma that told you this place was home. For many, David stepped in, and for a brief moment the room seemed to pause conversations. Off-ten fork shivered midair and curious eyes glanced in his direction. It wasn't hostility, it was something subtler, a mix of surprise and uncertainty. A soldier in full uniform wasn't a need. Ride sight hair and his presence demanded a moment of acknowledgement. He met the curious stares with a polite nod. Before scanning the room, booths lined the walls, most of them occupied by families, older couples, and a few teenagers glued to their phones. A jukebox in the corner played a faint country tune, blending seamlessly into the background. Near the window was mall tables, a tempty bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. David made his way to the table, the sound of his boots clicking against the tiled floor. Drawing a few more glances, she moved with the confidence that came from years of discipline, but his expression was calm, almost reserved. Sitting down, he eased into the chair, his hands brushing over the worn gist of the menu. She glanced at the offerings. It was simple, classic diner fare: burgers, milkshakes, fries. Exactly what he needed after months of eating field rations. Wes approached her, notepad in hand. She was in her 40s with a tired but friendly smile and eyes that hinted at a hard-working life. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her uniform, though slightly faded, was spotless. "What can I get you, Han?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd worked in hospitality. Longjana Tok know how to put people at ease. David smiled faintly. "Just a burger and coffee black." "Thanks." She jotted down his order within her pen, moving quickly over the pad. "Coming right up. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, David leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The street outside was quiet, with only the occasional caroling by. He felt a brief moment of peace, a small reprieve from the noise in his head. The memories of far-off places that never quite left them alone. For the first time in days, she allowed himself to feel the stillness, the normalcy, but note everyone shared his moment of peace. Near the counter, the dinner's manager leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. There was a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a deep furrow etched permanently between his brows, his eyes fixed on David, scanning him in a way that felt invasive, almost challenging. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. David noticed the gaze, but didn't react. Years of training had taught them when to pick his battles, and this wasn't one of them. He focused on the window, watching the sunlight bounce off the chrome bumpers of the car sparked outside, yet they couldn't shake the subtle tension in the room. It was the way conversations dipped slightly as she walked in, the way forks clattered just a little louder against plates. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a ripple. He couldn't ignore. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down gently in front of him. "Your burger will be out in a minute," she said, her tone kind but hurried. David thanked her, lifting the steaming cup to his lips. The bitterness of the coffee was grounding, a small comfort in an unfamiliar setting for a mom. Enthi allowed himself to relax. The world outside the diner faded, and it was just him and his coffee, the warmth off the mug seeping into his hands. But as she took another sip, the manager's voice cut through the air, low but unmistakably directed at him. The man had started walking toward David's table, his footsteps slow and deliberate. David set this cup down, his tensing slightly. Whatever peace he had felt moments ago was about to be shattered. The sound of the manager's boots grew louder as she approached, each step carrying a weight that David couldn't ignore. When the man finally stopped in front of him, the room seemed to hold its breath. The manager stopped a few feet from David's table, his posture stiff and his arms crossed tightly over his chest. This presence drew subtly tension from the other patrons who glanced up from their meals. In growing curiosity, David looked up from his coffee. his calm expression meeting the manager's stony glare. The air felt heavier, now the warmth off the diner giving way to a tension that crept into every corner of the room. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The manager said, his voice low but firm. David tilted his head slightly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me, hesked," his tone polite but edged with curiosity. "You heard me." The manager repeated his words sharper. "This time we're served the right to refuse a service. You need to go." For a moment, David just stared at them, the calm mask he'd perfected in the military slipping into place. It wasn't the first time he'd faced hostility, but something about being back home made this sting in a way he hadn't expected. He glanced around the diner, noticing how the room had gone. Unnaturally quiet, forks hung suspended over plates, an event the jukebox seemed to have dulled to a faint hum. "I'm just here for a meal," David said, his voice even, nothing more. The manager leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't about the food," he said, his tone dripping with implication. Malcolm's grip tightened around the edge of the table. Head didn't respond right away, instead letting the manager's words hang in the air, giving everyone in the room a chance to feel the weight of what was happening. Slowly, deliberately, David leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'd let me make sure I understand," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I walked in, ordered a burger and coffee. And now you're telling me you need to leave." Why? The manager shifted uncomfortably but held his ground like a Zed. "We're served the right to refuse a service, and I'm exercising that right." David's eyes scanned the room again. A few patrons looked away, pretending to focus on their plates. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Near the counter, the waitress who had taken David's orders stood frozen, her pen hovering above her note pay. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but hesitated, glancing nervously between David and the manager. David stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He was taller than the manager by a good few inches, and the way he carried himself, shoulders back, head high, made the difference seem even greater. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You serve this country," he said, his words deliberate. "I wore this uniform for you, for everyone in this room. I've spent years defending the freedoms you take for granted every day, and now you're telling me I don't belong." Here the room was completely silent. Now the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The manager's face flushed red, but it was unclear whether it was from anger or embarrassment. "Look," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "I don't care where you served. This is my restaurant, and I make the rules." David took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "You're right," he said quietly, "it is your restaurant. But let me ask you this, what kind of man turns away someone who's given everything to protect the very freedom she enjoys?" The manager didn't answer, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. The patrons watched insolence, their discomfort growing with each passing second. The young couple in the booth nearest to David exchanged uneasy glances, while an older man at the counter shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. David could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, but they didn't let it rattle him. Years of training had taught them how to stand his ground, even in the face of hostility. But this wasn't a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't someone carrying a weapon. It was ignorance, prejudice, and the quiet complicity of those who chose to look the other way. Here, etched into the pocket of his uniform, moving slowly and deliberately, a murmur rippled through the dinner as a few patrons sensed their imaginations jumping to the worst conclusions. David noticed but didn't react. He wasn't there to escalate the situation. He was here to make a point. From his pocket, he pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. It was worn around the edges, the creases soft from being handled too many times. Holding it up for a moment, he said, "I wasn't planning to share this today, but maybe it's time I did." The manager frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. David unfolded the paper with care, the silence in the room so complete that the faint rustle of the paper seemed deafening. "This," David began, his voice as steady as a letter from the family of Greg Mitchell. "He served with me overseas. She didn't make it back." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The tension in the rooms shifted, the hostility giving way to something quieter, curiosity, maybe even guilt. David looked at the letter in his hands, then back at the room. "Before I read his, I want you to understand something," he said. "This uniform I'm wearing, it's not just for me, it's for him, for his family, for every person who's ever had to say goodbye to someone they loved, not knowing if they'd come back." And as she began to read, the words from the letter carried a weight that noon in the dinner could ignore, leaving them hanging on his every word. David took a breath, steadying himself before beginning to read the letter aloud. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though not from fear. It was the weight off the words, the memories they carried, and the ions they would inevitably stir. His low and steady cut through the silence of the dinner. "Dear Greg Mitchell, we wanted to write to you as a family, not just to express our gratitude, but to let you know how much your actions have meant to us during the hardest time of our lives." David paused, glancing around the room. Some patrons set down their forks and knives. their meals forgotten. The older man at the counter leaned forward, elbows resting on the formica surface, his brow furrowed in concentration. The young mother, with her toddler in the corner, held her child Kel. Osi, her expressions softening with each word. David continued, his voice growing stronger. David always spoke so highly of you. He told us how you looked out for your team, how you made sure no one felt alone. Even in the darkest moments, she said, you weren't just a leader. You were the kind of person who made others believe in something greater. The manager, who had been so confident moments ago, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He shifted on his feet, crossing and uncrossing his arms, as if the weight of the letter's words were pressing down on him. David didn't acknowledge him. He kept reading, knowing that you were with Mitchell when he took his last breath means more Taos than words can ever express. You gave him comfort when we couldn't, you gave him strength when he needed it most. David's voice faltered slightly, but he didn't stop. He swallowed hard, regaining his composure. As a family, we've struggled to make sense of this loss, but your actions have reminded Dusuf the good that still exists in this world. You are a hero, not just because of the uniform you wear, but because of the heart you carry. Thank you for being there for our son when he needed it most. He folded the letter carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. The room was completely silent, the weight of the story hanging over everyone like a heavy fog. David looked up, his gazes weeping across the room. He wasn't just addressing the manager now, he was speaking to everyone. Lila is 23 years old, he said, his voice calm but firm. He had his whole life ahead of him. Affiance, he was planning to marry a family who adored him, and he gave all of that up so people like you and me could sit in a place like this, sharing meals, living our lives. David's eyes landed on the manager, who now stood near the counter, his face pale, and his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. When we put on this uniform, RM, we don't task who we're protecting. We don't care what they look like, where they come from, or how they feel about us. We do it because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. His voice dropped lower, but the intensity of his words only grew. But a day, I walked into this dinner wearing the same uniform I wore overseas, and I was told I don't belong. A murmur rippled through the room, the first sign of life from the patrons who had been stunned into silence. A teenage boy, near the jukebox, fidgeted with his phone, his expression a mix of guilt and discomfort. The older man he counter-shook his head lightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. David's gazes softened, and he turned to address the entire room. I wasn't going to say anything. I was just going to leave, but then I thought about Mitchell. I thought about his family, his dreams, and everything he sacrificed, and I realized I owe it to him and to every other soldier who's made that sacrifice to speak up. The young mother, near the window, wiped Adar from her cheek, her toddler squirming in her lap. The waitress, who had been standing frozen by the kitchen, now clutched her notepad tightly against their chest, their eyes glistening. David's final words cut through the thick silence like a blade. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. What kind of people? Our wife, we can't show basic respect to those who've given everything for us. As David's words settled over the room, the tension transformed into something else entirely, a quiet trek on a moment of collective reflection that left everyone waiting for what would happen next. The silence in the dinner felt almost deafening after David's words. People exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mixture of shame and introspection. Noondar to speak at first, the weight of what they had just heard pressing down on the room like an invisible force, then breaking. The silence, the older man sitting at the counter stood up, hished against the floor as she reached for his wallet. This movement, slow but deliberate, he cleared his throat. His voice is steady but filled with convictions. Sir, he said, addressing David, I'd like to pay for your meal. It's the least I can do for someone who's given so much for this country. The manager, still frozen near the counter, opened his mouth as if to protest, but the older man silenced him with a sharp glance. If there's an issue with that, he said firmly, you'll have to take it up with me. David looked at the man, his expression softening. That's kind of you, he said, but I don't need charity. It's not charity. The man replied, his tone unwavering. It's respect. Before David could respond, a young woman sitting in a booth near the windows spoke up. She had a toddler in her lap who squirmed as she tried to keep him still. I'll pitch him to. She said, her voice trembling slightly. You deserve to either, just like anyone else. One by one, more voices. You've got my respects. At a bus driver in the corner, nodding toward David, I'll cover his coffee. The waitress said, stepping forward. Ramhurstpot Earth Kitchen. She looked directly at David. Here. He is glistening. My brother served to didn't make it home. Thank you for everything you've done. Even the teenage boy near the jukebox, who'd been fidgeting awkwardly moments before, stood and gave David a small salute. It was clumsy and his face flushed red with embarrassment, but the gesture was sincere. The manager, who had been shrinking further into the background with every passing moment, now looked entirely out of place in his own establishment. His face was pale, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. She glanced around the room, realizing that he was alone in his stance. I didn't meant to cause a scene. The manager muttered, his voice barely audible. David turned to face him, fully, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You didn't just cause a scene," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You showed everyone here exactly who you are. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The manager's face flushed deeper. Dan, he looked down at the floor, unable to meet David's gaze for a moment. He seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, his pride warring with the guilt that was now unmistakably etched across his features. "Two made a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracked slightly, and he glanced around the room as if searching for some kind of support, but none came. The other patrons were silent, their faces a mix of disapproval and expectation. "Apologies don't mean much unless they come with change," David said. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the air. The manager nodded slowly, his expression still uneasy. "You're right," he admitted. I'm sorry. It wasn't much, but it was asked." Art, the tension in the room began to ease, the hostility giving way to something softer and unspoken, understanding that things could and should be different. The waitress stepped forward, again placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of David. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her smile was genuine. "Your coffee's on," Mesha said softly. David looked up, his expression warm. "Thank you," he said. He turned to address the room, once more, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through more than most could imagine. "This isn't just about me. It's about how we treat each other, every single one of you. If we can't show respect and kindness to the people sitting next to us, then what are we even fighting for?" The young mother near the window wiped arf from her cheek, her toddler now dozing peacefully in her arms. The older man at the counter nodded solemnly, his weathered face thoughtful. Event, the truck driver in the corner, who had been silently observing the home, seemed moved by David's words. As the room settled into a contemplative silence, Ollie's remained on David, waiting to see what he would do next. But his next tact wasn't what anyone expected. It was something that would stay with them long after he walked out the door. David stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle. The silence wasn't the Abbey with tension anymore. It felt different, now like a collective pause. As everyone reflected on what had just happened, he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his wallet. Without hesitation, he took out a crisp $20 bill and placed it on the table. "I'm paying for my meal," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. Respect isn't something that's handed to you, it's something you give, no matter what. And this is how I choose to give it." The statement. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories, subscribe to my channel.